Hello and welcome to Findex's federal budget webinar from surplus to stability. I'm your host, Lachlan McKinnon, and today I'll be joined by four subject matter experts to review and analyse the announcement of the 2020-2021 Australian federal budget and the implications it has for private individuals and households, small and medium-sized businesses, and large enterprises. We begin the webinar with a disclaimer. While all reasonable care is taken in this webinar to the extent allowed by legislation, Findex accepts no liability whatsoever for reliance on it. All opinions, conclusions, forecasts, or recommendations are reasonably held at time of publishing, but subject to change without notice. The information is of a general nature and does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, or needs. You should seek professional advice before acting on any material. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the thought or position of Findex. Let's introduce our four special guests for today's From Surplus to Stability webinar. Firstly, leading Australian economist, Stephen Koukoulas. Grow Australasia Managing Partner for Tax Advisory, Mark Azzopardi. Findex Associate Partner for Accounting and Business Advisory, Sarah Eltakchi. And Findex Senior Partner for Corporate Finance, Ross Patane. Welcome, everyone. Stephen, let's start with you and then on to the rest of the panel. Last night, the Morrison government announced its delayed budget for the 2020-2021 financial year. And there was a lot of expectation around how they would respond to COVID-19 and the economic recession we now find ourselves in as a country. What were the major announcements to get the economy growing again?
Look, they had an effort to try to deal with how we're in a deep recession now and set the framework for a recovery in the economy into 2021 and to 2022. So they've assumed that the vaccination will be found during next year, which from what I can gather is a reasonable estimate. But when we look at what the economy is doing, what we've lost in the economy shutting down during 2020, that 7.5% fall in GDP that we've seen, we won't regain that lost output for another 3 years. So the economic pickup is actually relatively benign. It's not that bounce back that we were all hoping for, despite the best efforts of the government in the budget last night. So they're really banking on a return in confidence. That's the other thing. They've got investment incentives out there. They've got incentives to hire, to engage new apprentices and the like. All good policies, all really important stepping stones, if you like, in getting the economy back onto an even keel. But the missing ingredient right here and now is business confidence. Businesses need to have the confidence to take advantage of these tax concessions, apprenticeship schemes and the like. And at the moment, with the economy still a little uncertain, the missing ingredient is that confidence. So they're hoping that that comes back and that people, firms, individuals take advantage of these schemes that are there. Now, look, it was a solid effort, a really difficult framework, a really difficult environment that the budget was put together, things changing very rapidly as they're framing these policy settings. And I think it's important to say that this is not the last word on economic policy. They will react to new news on the economy as it comes through. So if we find, for example, that, hey, there's an early vaccination that's discovered, the economy is better than expected, well, of course, that's good news, but some of the measures here will probably not be there forever. Or on the other hand, of course, if we have a problem that emerges, there's a breakout, other lockdowns in the major cities domestically here in Australia, then of course it's all bets off and they'll revisit it, as they have done since the onset of this pandemic. They've adjusted fairly quickly as circumstances change. But here and now, budget, a solid effort made in really difficult circumstances, and being optimistic, it does actually help the economy when we start kicking off 2021 and thinking about how we're going to be performing then.
Yeah, I agree with all those observations, Stephen. The COVID-19 pandemic's brought on the first recession in 30 years, so government is spending big on infrastructure, job creation, asset write-offs, and they have to borrow big to do so. So by committing additional $25 billion in COVID response measures, that brings the total since the onset of the pandemic to $198 billion. And it's made up of $184 billion of economic response measures and $14 billion in health response measures. So government's trying really hard now to aim to transition its spending measures to ensure the economy recovers strongly, instilling that business confidence, targeting additional temporary support measures to boost household incomes, bring forward that business and infrastructure investment activity and drive the unemployment rate back down.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with both Ross and Stephen's comments there. It's essential that we instill some confidence back in the economy. It was an absolutely essential budget that the government handed down last night. It is a punt, of course, and it does rely heavily on three things being prevalent throughout the economy, and that is, businesses will use these additional tax cuts and subsidies to hire new people and invest as well in their businesses. Secondly, it's going to be essential that consumers actually spend their tax savings going forward, as opposed to saving and using it to pay off mortgages. And thirdly, it's the essential requirement that a vaccine is not too far away. And of course, coming with that is Victoria moving out of lockdown in a pretty rapid manner.
Yeah, I agree. The budget did have a very strong emphasis on finding that vaccine by the end of next year, and a lot of that confidence is placed around that and the positivity. It did spark, hopefully, a lot of that missing confidence out in the economy. The budget is all about jobs, getting people back in employment and businesses spending money. So it was an unprecedented budget with SMEs and businesses really placed at the forefront of the economic recovery. A number of opportunities with investment and job creation. So hopefully it's enough to create and hold on to that.
Stephen, let's turn our attention to the broader economic forecast. In a crisis, we're told by experts that the bottom line numbers don't matter as much. But what does this financial hole that we find ourselves in mean for us in the medium and the long term?
It means that we've got a lot of legwork to do to regain the lost output and to regain the jobs that have also been lost or have been allocated to JobKeeper programs during the course of the pandemic. But so it's going to be a slow recovery. It's not that bounce back that we were all hoping for and hoping to see. And look, there's a couple of issues within the budget, again, which are sort of the headwinds to a stronger recovery. One of them, which didn't get a lot of attention, is the structural lowering in the potential with which the Australian economy can grow. Over the last couple of decades, we've got used to the fact that the Australian economy, when it's doing well, is growing at about 2.75% per annum. That's the sort of optimal rate of economic growth, if you like. That was enough to create good jobs, to allow business to make a decent profit. It didn't create inflation pressures, and it created enough jobs for the economy. What's happened in the budget papers, and of course as a result of immigration being cut to nothing during the international border lockdown, is that Treasury now estimate potential GDP growth in Australia is now around about 2%. So we've lost about 0.75% per annum in terms of our potential GDP, simply because we don't have the population here for at least the next couple of years. So that means, for example, for housing, construction activity, that the number of new houses that we need to build for new immigrants to either rent or to buy, didn't really matter, we needed to construct them, will be about 20% lower than we're assuming pre-COVID. So the suppliers of business materials, those in the construction side for dwellings, are going to have to deal with that for at least the next 2 years. It's a little too early to say what the immigration numbers will be post finding a cure or finding a vaccination for COVID-19. But that's one headwind, that the Australian economy will just not register the growth that we sort of got used to for the last couple of decades. That'll feed into our business thinking, our investment decisions as well. The other one, of course, is the budget highlighted that real wages are going to be flat or going backwards. That is, wages will not be keeping pace with the rate of inflation. A lot of us have experienced wage cuts, wage freezes, and that limits the household sector's ability to spend money. If you're not getting a pay increase, it's hard to go out there and ramp up your spending, which is really needed in the economy. Bring in the income tax cuts that we've been seeing over the last, or that have been included in the budget. That's what's going to give us the disposable income to allow us to spend. So, again, the question is, will we use those tax cuts to pay off debt or to plonk into savings? Well, I can understand why people would do it. They're cautious. But what the government really wants to see is us take that money, spend it, get it in the economy, give businesses a bit of a shot in the arm.
And I think it's important to look at the impact of windbacks to JobKeeper and JobSeeker. So JobKeeper and JobSeeker have cost a lot of money. It's saved hundreds and thousands of jobs. However, it's not something that can or will continue. There's no provision in the budget for any payments beyond 2021. And the wind back of JobKeeper will unfortunately result in a higher unemployment rate. It's assisted a lot of people to stay in employment throughout this period, but unemployment is forecast to reach a quarterly peak of around 8% in the December quarter, December 2020. It's then forecast to fall to 6.5% by the June quarter, in line with the different recovery and activity that's come out. And this, as Stephen said, combined with low wage growth, will result in low dwelling investment, which is a big driver in the economy.
I guess it's also feeding into the minds of business and the electorate in political discourses. We're notching up a record $213.7 billion deficit in this budget. And we've got net debt predicted to peak at $966 billion by 2024. This is because the government's borrowing to focus on growing the economy and creating jobs. Never mind the interest bill from the spending binge, though. The lowest interest rates globally in 1,000 years mean that our national credit card bill, as a proportion of GDP, is actually falling below the lowest levels of the deficit budgets we've seen in the last decade. So gross debt will hit $1.138 trillion by 2024, which is 50% of GDP, pretty low by world standards, but still feeding into that sentiment that the recession economy is forecast to contract by 1.5% this year before rebounding to 4.75 next year off a low base and returning to its annual growth trend of around 2.75% in 22-23.
Ross, we'll stick with you. Sarah mentioned that mass employment's a huge issue at the moment, and it's a huge issue during any financial crisis, with a long, treacherous road back to pre-COVID-19 numbers. Does this budget do enough on that front, and could more be done?
Yeah, look, you can see $74 billion being invested in the JobMaker plan. So you see the government is pretty serious about backing up its jobs slogans. Government's first priority is secure strong and sustained economic recovery to drive the unemployment rate down as fast as possible. If you have a look at the JobMaker plan, it touches on many regions and sectors of the economy. So it's a major initiative designed to support aggregate demand, but it's also taking our economy in a post-pandemic direction that recognises some of the shifting geopolitical issues we face as a nation, with increased focus on self-reliance in manufacturing industries and critical supply chain and infrastructure.
Just quickly on jobs, it's going to take a while to get that unemployment rate back to 5%. We know that the month before COVID came along, we had an unemployment rate of 5%, which was not bad. The Treasury's saying we're not going to get back to 5% unemployment until 2025. So while there's money being thrown, the kitchen sink's been thrown at this problem, and we've got a recovery coming, getting all of those people who lost their jobs back to work is going to take quite a while, and it'll require probably policy to remain very easy, very, very stimulatory, not just budget policy, but interest rate policy as well, to achieve that goal.
I think there was also a really strong emphasis with the JobMaker policy around employment for people 35 and under. I don't think there's enough incentive. It's almost like 35, anyone older than 35 will now be competing. There's no incentive for a business to hire someone older when they can get the JobMaker credit for someone younger. So I think it's also going to have a bit of an effect. While it's a great incentive for the younger people, there are a number of people over 35 who have unfortunately become unemployed, and that's going to be a bigger struggle now for them to find employment.
Mark, let's move across to the way in which the coalition government has responded to overall business investment and outlook. How did they approach it?
Clearly, last night's measures handed down were initiatives to get businesses investing and hiring again. One could describe last night's measures as a bit of a fun budget announcement for those businesses with the confidence and ambition to supercharge the growth of their business. There's a number of cash boosts from the government stimulus that's been handed down previously, and from these measures last night,
they're going to have the potential to see entrepreneurs back themselves with aggressive investment growth and staff hiring plans. I guess for many, it could be viewed as a once-in-a-career opportunity for those who've got the steel to take on these opportunities.
Look, I think that's a fair assessment too, because the incentives are there for people to invest. The hard numbers on the business investment outlook showed that for the current fiscal year, obviously impacted by the lockdowns, that CapEx is going to be down by about 9.5%. So a big fall in 2021 financial year, but Treasury are forecasting a 6% rebound in the following financial year. So they'll regain a lot of that lost investment that we're seeing here and now, and it's going to be helped by low interest rates from the RBA, that if you're wanting to borrow money to ramp up your CapEx right now, now's a pretty good time. So near term, there's probably some downside, but as the business sector digests what's in the budget, they see hopefully the opening up of Victoria and maybe interstate borders as well in the coming weeks and months, that the CapEx will recover.
I think the Treasury pushed the right buttons at the right time to at least try and restore some level of consumer and business confidence and stimulate business investment. The measures like the instant asset write-off, infrastructure spending pipeline, R&D tax initiatives, and JobMaker hiring credit are all intended to drive business forward with a level of confidence.
Yeah, I think the investment incentives announced by the business is the largest any government has ever provided, and really is a game changer. And 100% deduction for eligible investments with no limit, and 99% of businesses or Australian businesses have access to it. That's just massive, and in itself hopefully will generate millions of jobs. I don't know whether there was enough to really have anything to incentivise businesses to retain employees, but I think there is a strong push for new hire.
Mark, concessional tax measures were one of the major talking points in the days and weeks leading up to the announcement last night. What's in store for private individuals, households, SMEs and large enterprises?
Yeah, so there was a number of tax concessional measures announced last night. Many of them were preempted prior to budget night, but the ones that stand out for individuals, we've brought forward the stage 2 tax cuts for individuals, which means that if you're a middle income earner, say earning up to $120,000, there's going to be potential for a tax saving for a single of about $2,745, or for a family unit as much as $5,500. So we're seeing tax brackets moving in order for those in the middle income ranges to be generating these tax savings. Sarah just touched on the instant asset write-off. That's huge. That's for any businesses that's got an aggregated turnover of less than $5 billion. There's an available full deduction for any eligible depreciable assets that are purchased from last night's budget announcements, and those assets that are installed ready for use by 30 June 2022. So this is going to include assets, or the cost of improving existing eligible assets, and for SMEs, full expensing also will apply to the acquisition of second-hand assets. And of course, there are other instant write-off concessions currently available for SMEs. There's also going to be an expansion to the access of the small business tax concessions. It's now going to be entitled to those companies that have an aggregated turnover of up to $50 million, and there is access to 10 additional small business concessions that will be available to those entities. Lost carryback is an interesting one. We trialled this back about 6 years ago, and it was repealed, but obviously with a number of entities distressed in current times, we've got an opportunity for entities who may be making a current year loss due to the COVID times, but have previously, in the FY19 and FY20 years, might have paid tax on their profits. There's going to be an opportunity in the FY21 and FY22 years for those loss-making years to go back and recoup the taxes that were paid in, say, the 18, 19 and 20 income years, so that those prior taxes paid can be recovered as a bit of a cash boost for those businesses. So there is no restriction to that other than the amount of tax that was paid in the 19 and 20 years. And also, it can't put you in a franking deficit position. So for those entities that have paid franked dividends to its shareholders, there will be a limitation on how much you can call back in prior taxes being paid. I guess the final one I wanted to point out was the states and territory government grants that have been made available during these COVID times. So anything that's been announced post 13 September 2020 through to 30 June 21, those amounts will be received as a tax-free amount to businesses.
Stephen, who are the winners and losers when it comes to infrastructure spending in this budget?
Oh, look, there was a real concerted effort to give money to the regions. There's a couple of regional funds that are receiving money, and included in that is a boost to regional tourism. Given that we can't holiday to Bali or to Europe or anything for the foreseeable future, and we're still busting to get out at home and have a look around over our summer that's coming up, they're giving incentives for the tourism sector to do well. So we're going to be holidaying in our regional areas, and that's a big plus. There was a sharp increase in transport infrastructure funding. The bulk of that is roads, although there is a little bit on the rail, and of course the second airport in Sydney continuing to be rolled out and constructed, of course. So there's going to be this element where the regions are probably going to do pretty well out of this budget, including with, as I said, that incentive to travel to the regions. So that's a good thing. They probably didn't quite do as much as some people would like on the energy front, particularly renewables. There's a discussion there whether we like it or not. It seems the world, including us, will go down that path of renewables. So perhaps they could have been a little more aggressive in allocating money to renewables. But hey, that's might be a story for another year. But for now, I think the focus of where the infrastructure money is going to go is very much to rural and regional Australia, and that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, Stephen, I can see $14 billion committed since the onset of COVID-19 pandemic to boost demand through infrastructure funding, creating about 40,000 jobs over the next 4 years. I did a word search on the budget papers last night, and the word infrastructure appears no less than 340 times. So you can see how it features heavily in the government's plans. There is an investment, $1.9 billion, in some new energy technologies. May not necessarily be renewable energy, but at least will aim to reduce emissions and ensure Australians have access to reliable energy. I think the other thing about the infrastructure spend is JobMaker is woven into some of that $14 billion in new infrastructure accelerated projects across Australia over the next 4 years, and it seems like every state and territory is a winner in this infrastructure lottery with a new road upgrade, bridge improvement or rail extension near a Findex office somewhere in Australia. And the other thing I noticed was quietly buried, the government's making some equity funding boosts to the Inland Rail project and some naval infrastructure, some important nation building logistics and national security infrastructure initiatives advanced without interfering in some of the commercially sensitive contractual or national security issues there.
Sarah, you work with businesses every day in your role in the business advisory space. From a business perspective, what are the emerging opportunities as a result of budget announcements?
The main opportunities for SMEs and businesses in general is definitely around that investment piece and employment. It's the 100% instant asset write-off is, like I said, it's a huge game changer. It's something that will, for those who can afford to invest, I mean, obviously COVID turned a number of fundamentally good businesses into loss-making businesses. Some of them, in particular in Victoria, or just depending on the industry, are still hanging by a thread. So there are some where it'll create huge opportunities for them. For some, was the budget enough to help them? It's definitely created a lot of optimism and a positive outlook. I still think, and as Stephen has said previously, you know, policies will change as this whole pandemic keeps evolving. There still needs to be a bit of work. There are some gaps. The loss carryback measures, for example, they're good, they're great, but they won't actually come into play until the FY21 financial year. So that cash flow injection that the budget is trying to bring in, the idea is there, but I think the cash flow won't come for another 10 months at least, which is, you know, still difficult. And I think, again, with the investment piece, there's still the issue of obtaining funding for a lot of businesses. So until we can get some assistance with that, I think once that businesses are able to get access to better funding, then the investment will create a lot more opportunity for businesses.
In addition to that, I think there's some fantastic ongoing support for all those businesses, quite innovative in their mindsets and doing a lot of R&D. So a couple of years ago, there was proposed rules whereby those tax concessions were going to be pulled back a little bit. Last night, we heard that those proposed pullbacks will be deferred until 1 July 21, which is fantastic for these types of companies, because what we're going to see is an ongoing tax concession, which for small businesses, say of an aggregated turnover of less than $20 million, they'll avail themselves of an extra 18.5% cash refund over and above their, call it 30% corporate tax rate on any eligible R&D expenditure. And they're also proposing to remove that $4 million cash cap that was going to be applied under the new rules. So for those businesses a bit larger, more than $20 million, there's going to continue to be attractive R&D measures for them. However, it's going to be in a non-refundable tax offset form, so it can be used to reduce the amount of income tax that you physically paid. And there's going to be two tests here. If your R&D expenditure is less than 2% of your total business expenditure, then there's an effective rebate of 38.5%. But for those who've got R&D expenditure in excess of 2% of their total expenditure, that could increase as much as 46.5% as a non-refundable tax offset.
And I think the main opportunity that came up and to focus on with that R&D is the fact that, you know, the government has realised that there needs to be that boost around the advanced manufacturing piece, which is something that's been really highlighted throughout this whole COVID pandemic in Australia in particular.
I guess there's another measure in the budget which isn't necessarily an expenditure or revenue measure, but it proposes some changes to the insolvency framework that means it's been the biggest change to that framework in over 30 years. So the government's putting up a framework for those businesses that might find the recovery process not as straightforward as others, a mechanism to restructure, reset and recover from the COVID pandemic. So that the changes are designed to help smaller businesses quickly restructure to survive the economic impact, and where a restructure is not possible, enable those businesses to wind up faster and indeed cheaper. Package of reforms got three key elements: a formal debt restructuring process for small businesses to provide a faster and less complex mechanism to restructure their existing debts. If that doesn't work, a new simplified liquidation pathway for small businesses to allow a faster and low-cost liquidation, and also some complementary measures to ensure that the insolvency sector can respond effectively both in the short and long term, the potential increased fund, and to the needs of small business. So the measures are aligned to the US Chapter 11 bankruptcy provisions, which have been effective for many years, and really put the debtor in control of the process at the outset to resolve the business's difficulties with the support of the creditors.
Stephen, finally, we know it's an extraordinary year when it comes to the timing of the federal budget announcement. The government typically releases it in May of any given year ahead of the end of financial year. So with this year's federal budget set to be announced in 6 to 7 months' time, what can we expect on the horizon?
Oh, look, as we've been discussing, it's a moving feast. What happens between now and then is going to be the critical issue. So how will business respond to what we've seen in this budget? How will they respond to the fact that interest rates are low? How will they respond with the opening up, touch wood, of the borders and the fact that we consumers are going to be getting tax cuts? But it's important to also remember that the next budget in May 2021 is probably going to be delivered just, say, about 6 months before a federal election. And we know in Australia we have elections come around very, very quickly, every 3 years. And so I think it's going to be one where the government will be wanting to ensure that they've got the economy growing strongly. The debt and deficit issues, look, they'll be around somewhere in the debate. But really, if they can put their hand on their heart and say, look, we've got the economy growing again, that trajectory for a lower unemployment rates being delivered, and the Labor Party, if they're going to be competitive, has to come up with a really solid alternative. So that's going to be the outlook for 2021. But of course, it depends also. There's a couple of big global issues that we've got to keep an eye on. The US presidential elections coming up in early November, and I won't go into that in any great detail, but it does look as if there's going to be a change in administration if the polls are right now are correct. And Joe Biden, while he's probably not the most dynamic, charismatic sort of president the US has ever seen, maybe the US needs someone who's a little bit boring for the next 4 years. I don't know, but that's certainly an interesting question, even though the business sector would probably prefer a Trump win and all the sort of low tax, pro sort of stimulus measures that he's going to go on about. And of course, there's the lingering issue of China. It's recovered nicely, to be honest, from its problems on the pandemic earlier in the year. Iron ore prices are strong. That's certainly a real shot in the arm for the Australian economy. However, there's a bit of tension between China and the Western world, including us here. We saw the wine and the barley exports sort of being subjected to some sort of anti-dumping laws and the like. So, look, between now and the next budget, there's a myriad of issues. And, what we're going to be talking about then, hopefully, is about a recovery. Hopefully that we've got some traction. Hopefully this pandemic's been addressed, or we're learning to live with it. Because if that's the case, then maybe the second half of 2021 will actually be a year of relatively strong growth. We can certainly hope that's the case anyway.
Whilst I would agree that the measures handed down last night in last night's budget were the right ones for the current circumstances, I think we all recognise there's a number of headwinds still ahead of us. Sarah touched on the removal of the JobKeeper stimulus and JobSeeker stimulus that is only around the corner, and of course there's people with mortgage deferrals currently that need to be dealing with that. So the response is not going to be just from businesses, but how's it going to affect the property market? How's commercial properties going to cope with a changing workforce moving forward, because we all expect that the new norm is going to be very different to what it was pre-COVID. So lots of headwinds still to work through, which, to Stephen's point, is absolutely essential that we do remain agile and ready to adapt to the changing circumstances, which will continue.
I agree, and I think with most of Australia getting back to operating in a new form of normal, the unknown will be how badly this second wave in Victoria will actually impact on the recovery of the economy across the country. Victoria represents 33% of our national economy, and we need Victoria to bounce back strongly and quickly if as a nation is to be successful. I think we're lucky because we've got a Victorian Federal Treasurer literally with his fingers on the pulse of the Victorian economy. So let's hope he can get his home state patient off life support and into intensive care, ready for what's expected to be, the next pre-federal election budget in the next round.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are still so many variables up in the air, so many questions that we can't answer because it's just changing on an ongoing and a daily basis. And I think But like we've said so many times, you know, there's still the end of JobKeeper. Even the JobKeeper 2.0 is going to have significant changes for people. So many businesses aren't eligible for it. So I think it'll start to be that first sign as to what the economy really, what real situation we're in. We've sort of got a little bit of padding at the moment. So I think there's still a lot more hurdles to overcome before we get to that next budget and election.
That brings our 2020-2021 Australian Federal Budget webinar from surplus to stability to a close. A special thank you to our 4 subject matter experts today: Stephen Koukoulas, Mark Azzopardi, Sarah Eltakchi, and Ross Patane. You can access additional content and up-to-date information and specialist analysis on the federal budget and its ongoing implications for private individuals and households, small and medium-sized business, and large enterprises by visiting the Findex Australia website at www.findex.com.au. You can also follow our social media channels for ongoing updates on Facebook and LinkedIn by searching for Findex Australia. My name is Lachlan McKinnon, and on behalf of the team, thank you for joining us. Goodbye for now.